part 4 of putting the Praga engine together, and I start this with an apology. In the last part, I made this oil filler arrangement up, and I was a little concerned about the cap coming off still. One of my viewers suggested I peen the top of the thread over here, and I initially poo-pooed that idea and thought I'd put a split pin through, and then I remembered that General Melchett had rather a lot to say about poo-poos.
Is this true, Blackadder? Did Captain Darling poo-poo you?
Well, perhaps a little.
Well then, damn it all, what more evidence do you need? The poo-pooing alone is a court-martial offence.
So thank you, Dale. It was an excellent idea, and no more poo-poos from me. I need to paint the cylinder barrels, but before I do that, I'm going to hone them, we'll take a look inside, and then gap the new oil control rings. If you're honing cylinders with the head still attached, it's worth dropping a plywood disc down the hole. The ply disc stops the three-legged honer bashing the cylinder head. Please excuse the wobble vision, but I wanted to show you in the cylinders now they've been honed. See if this thing will focus reasonably well. There you can see there's very little wear. The thing had only done 107 hours from new, but I think it must have seized up during its storage. It's no great surprise. I think when this last ran in August 1939, there were bigger issues concerning the Austrian corporal than the preservation of fairly useless two-cylinder aeroplane engines. So it must have seized up at some point. You can see where the rings have rusted themselves to the bores. That's those circular little marks. And there's a bit of a rusted patch down here as well. It's not awful and it's not too deep, but I think it probably renders the engine not airworthy. But of course that doesn't really matter. The whole purpose of this exercise was to get the thing running and to preserve it and take it away from its corroding state. So that is being fulfilled, even if it never goes on the front of another aeroplane. So that first one was actually the number 2 cylinder. Here's the number 1 cylinder. And again, I'll try and focus the iPad so you can see. Someone did a very good job of cleaning the cylinders up. You can see the Hemi valves there. That's all very nice. But again, this barrel's quite rusted. It's rusted at the top with marks that make it look as if it's seized. And there's quite a lot of pitting down the side. There's also some more rusting at the bottom there, suggesting the rings were again rusted to the barrel further down. But honing has taken the worst off. Giving a hone like that isn't going to make anything worse. It's going to give the new oil control rings something to bite on, and the compression rings can sort of run themselves in again as well. As removed from the engine, the pistons were fairly gruesome looking. Unlike the aeronca, these have 3 compression rings and an oil control ring. The aeronca just has the 2 compression rings and an oil control ring. But all the rings were absolutely stuck solid, and it looked quite corroded. I couldn't free them off at first. In fact, I ended up boiling them in this pot. You can still see the marks where they stood for about 2 days in very sort of heavily detergent filled water. And amazingly, suddenly all the rings sprang off. Now these are the compression rings. 6 of them were fine. If I hold that up, you can see it still says top on the ring, and they're fine. They're really good, all usable, none broken. One oil control ring was not broken and came out and possibly could be used again, although the slot is completely filled with carbon. But the other ring was missing a chunk, not to be found anywhere. So I think someone had had a go at pulling the rings out, and all they'd managed to do was break one piston ring. They probably gave up at that. Anyway, once the rings were removed, it was easy to clean the pistons up, and they're actually quite good. A little bit of scoring on the sides, but not bad at all. I tried for some time, but without success, to buy a couple of new oil control rings. I used to buy my rings from a gentleman called Philip Daintree in Manchester, who was absolutely wonderful at supplying any piston ring. But unfortunately, Mr. Daintree's retired, which is a bit of a shame. Not before he supplied me about 10 sets of aeronca piston rings, because I knew he was going to pack up. So I got all manner of things a few years ago from him. He was a really good chap. Anyway, I found another useful chap in Sussex who deals in piston rings, and he was able to provide me a pair of oil control rings. They're rather nice actually. Look, they came with this lovely packet. 1976 Hepalite for liveliness. And they're ideal. The only thing is that they are slightly wider than the ring gap as is. That's not a problem. I'm going to put these in the lathe and just ease the gap out a little bit. I've had to do such things before. The Vauxhall is running re-ringed pistons and fairly ropey bores. Doesn't seem to matter, goes like a train. This is number 1 cylinder. It's the one I've already adjusted the ring for. Basically, the cast iron rings, one just files the ends very gently until they fit. One could measure it with a feeler gauge if one wanted to, but I can see that that's absolutely fine as is. It's really not rocket science. So that's good, that one can come out. I better marry them to pistons straight away, so I shall declare that this piston goes with that barrel. And that's all number 1. This is the other ring that needs gapping, and we'll bring the number 2 barrel over. Let's put it that way around so it can't fall off the bench, and carefully adjust it. It is possible to be very high church when doing this sort of thing and insist on grinding, etc. And, well, for the amount that needs removing, it really isn't worth setting up any kind of grinding device. The main thing is to try and keep this square, so square that way and square that way as well, although it can have a little bit of sort of back rake, obviously, as the ring comes together. And just work away gently, taking off a little bit of material at a time and trying it in the bore. There's nothing more to it than that. You know, Measure twice, cut once being a good rule, so don't just keep filing away for ages and then finding the ring gap's about 40 thou or something. Needs about 10 thou, nothing more. No, it just doesn't quite go. A tiny bit more. I'm not going to film that, just bear with me. There we are, that's got it. And just a nice little gap. Excellent. The cylinder assemblies look a lot better after a bath in cellulose thinners, good wire brushing, and I painted the barrels with etch primer and then black. The paint is touch dry already, but of course it'll take a few days to harden up. In the meantime, if you thought the Schelde Scheldemeeuw was potty enough in the last film, well, there was an aquatic version too. I found this old newsreel film, which I believe has never been heard before.
Here we see the Schelde Scheldemeeuw. It's the latest aircraft from the Dutch aviation company with a completely unpronounceable name. Powered by a Praga B2 engine from Czechoslovakia, it has a top speed of 80 miles an hour. Here she comes. Oh, I say, bumps-a-daisy.
In spite of the bumps-a-daisy landing, the Scheldemeeuw actually had very good sea handling qualities, but only one was built and it was never sold. It was rebuilt with a metal hull as a practice piece for De Schelde, who had taken on making Dornier 24 hulls under subcontract from Avialanda. It was broken up before the Second World War. I need to put the pistons in the lathe and turn the gaps for the oil control rings. It's not very easy to film because the aeronca C2 fuselage is poked through the machine shop. I wouldn't describe it as in the way, but I have to go under it to get to the lathe. Just like Robert Maxwell, I'm going to be bobbing up and down for some time. The pistons won't fit in my self-centering 3-jaw chuck, even with the outside jaws fitted. So I have to swap it over to a 4-jaw non-self-centering chuck. This isn't a problem, but I'll have to use a dial test indicator, or more commonly known as a clock, to make sure the pistons are running true before I start turning them. It's a metric clock and the run out is 4/100ths of a millimetre, less than 2 thou. That's good enough for this job. Each piston takes a few minutes to turn. I don't want to cock the job up, so I'm being careful and just taking light cuts, checking as I go. Bugger. Not very easy to see, but the ring gap is wide enough. And the way to check, if it's always a bit tight, it was on the last cut, if it's tight, do not adjust the tool. Just put the tool in and out once more because it will take the tiniest cut. And you roll the ring backwards round the groove. I mean, I'm really pleased with that. That's absolutely spot on. Tiny bit tight there, but I'm not going to put the tool back through it. I'm just going to check the ring hasn't got a tiny bit of corrosion on it or anything there. Yeah, no, in fact, it's not particularly tight. If I try it in another place, of course, we can tell whether it's the ring or the slot. It's actually the ring. It's just ever so slightly tight. I can see to that. In fact, there's a tiny mark on the ring there. It is corrosion, actually. There's a tiny spot on it, which I shall just, well, no, I won't attack with an angle grinder. I'll just attack it with some very fine wet and dry. That will get rid of that. But that is done. That's very pleasing. I'll just stand behind the camera here, hold round there. There was a little spot of corrosion there, tiny, tiny spot, merely with a flat file. Just rubbed it away. So I'm going to go and try that in the ring slot again and see if it's tight. I think it'll be fine. So once more, it's like escaping from HMS Thetis. Not that many people did. Perfect. There we are. Goes straight in. Good. Well, that's a good job. There's the ring gap widened. If this had been a flying engine, I'm not sure I would have accepted such a wider ring. I think I'd have hunted around a lot more, or even commissioned a new pair of oil control rings. But as it's very, very unlikely to fly, and really we're trying to build a runner, then I think it's acceptable. Certainly hasn't compromised the integrity of the piston. Just a bit wider than I would have thought ideal. Look at that. It's going around like the altimeter on a Stuka dive bomber. All right, well, she needs a bit of work. Very, very close. Just try running the tool down it. That's a bit tight. Tiny, tiny bit on the handle. That's more like it. The last job on the bottom end proper is to fit the nut in front of the thrust bearing. It has a tab washer behind. Fortunately, the tab washer and the nut are the same size for the aeronca. Obviously the hole in the tab washer had to be fired out a little bit, but otherwise that was easy, and the normal spanner for the aeronca engine fitted. The thrust plate goes on with the gasket behind. I cut one out of the flexoid paper. Once the gasket is bolted up tight, it's important to check the rotation of the crankshaft. If the crankshaft feels in any way stiff, then fit paper shims or even another gasket. I had already tried this and it felt a bit tight, so I fitted a second layer of flexoid and it was fine. Like all good live television, I'm now going to try and get the piston pins, gudgeon pins, into the pistons. These have been in the freezer. In fact, they've been in there for a week. It's both gudgeon pins. And so they're nice and cold. They're frostier than a reception at the Russian embassy. I made a spigot for them to go on so I can sort of bash them into place without fear of hitting the piston. And the pistons are in the boiling pan, so I'll go and grab a piston and we'll see if we can get the pin in without too much bad language. Cooking instructions, well, they had about 20 minutes at boiling point, I suppose. That's 100 degrees centigrade or 220 something Fahrenheit. Just try and dry them off a bit so I don't end up with lots of moisture over them, but they're nice and hot. So a pin on the spigot. Now what could possibly go wrong? Well, that's in. Took a bit of a walloping, but, well, it's in. Good. Well, that piston was straight off the boiling pan, so maybe the first one will just cool down a bit, even in a couple of minutes. Good. Well, that's worked, and they're both on. Just going to put the circlip in the end of the gudgeon pin. Just note there's a little nick out of the piston there, just down the skirt. There's one the other side as well. I think somebody was trying to get the piston pins in once before, because I'm sure that's what they've actually marked with a pair of pliers or something as they get it in. Anyway, here goes. The trick, as far as I can remember from the aeronca ones, and it worked the other side, was to put half the pin in, then very carefully squeeze the other half up with some pliers. Sod. Did the other one without the camera running, of course, so it went straight in. This one will be a swine, I'm sure. I had to turn the camera off then. The language was too appalling even for anyone to hear. But I've got the piston clip, the circlip, half in and half out. You can see there. That's the kind of Llewellyn zone where it could sort of ping either way. I'm just going to push it into place now, I think, with this piece of bar. There we go. It's in. Of course, you saw me donking away at these pins, and you're probably wondering, well, how the hell did Llewellyn change the pistons, get the gudgeon pins in and out on the aeronca? Well, as I recall, the gudgeon pins aren't quite so difficult to get in and out on the aeronca pistons. And secondly, he was desperate. I'm not. You know, my schedule would be delayed by a few hours of swearing away at this if it wouldn't go in and out. He was going to end up as lunch for Larry the Lion. The paint has finally dried and the cylinders are ready for reassembly. I ground the valves in the other night. I didn't film it. Quite frankly, I actually caught up with some podcasts and some YouTube stuff that I wanted to watch while I was messing around. And there really wasn't much to see. The valves are very good. This is an exhaust valve. It's hardly pitted. It's got a lovely face on it. And the seats were very good as well in the cylinders. They are a steel seat, unlike the aeronca with its bronze seat. So they're much harder. And as far as I could see, there was no wear or anything at all. It was really just a case of lapping them in just because it was all apart. So I'll put them together now. The valve lifter for the aeronca works, so it's a really easy job. We've reached that wonderful moment where it's time to put a cylinder on. I'm actually quite excited about this. Been looking forward to getting this engine together for a long time. So, a bit of oil down the bore and smear it around a bit. I'll try wrestling them on. I don't use a piston ring compressor. I haven't got one with the aeronca even. They usually just go in. There's a bit of a taper on the end of the barrel which helps pop the rings in. So, see if we can get it on without resort to too much profanity, like the Queen Mother encouraging her horses at Ascot. That's one in. Two. At this point I remember I haven't actually put a nut on the side, so the barrel will fall off possibly. Anyway, let's just keep going. Third, just this oil controlling. Now, these rings are big. Of course, unlike the other rings that have been compressed before, this one hasn't. You know, an engine, it hasn't been run or anything. It's going in. Come on, you swine. Ow. To my finger as well. It bit me. It might bleed, who cares? Right. Up we go. And let's push that up the bore a bit more. I've got the red caught. Bugger. There we go. Right. I haven't put any gunjo on the cylinder base at the moment. There we are. Don't need a nut. Marvellous. Well, that's very pleasing. I'll just put one base nut on for now. Of course, there's still the pushrod tubes to go in, so we'll have to slide the cylinders off a little way to get those in a moment. Anyway, just wind a nut on, and then whatever I do the other side, the cylinder can't fall off. These are the pushrod tubes. They're very soft aluminium. They get bent and damaged very easily. In fact, this one I've straightened. It had a big dent in it here as well, which I've pushed out by putting a bar down the inside. It was somewhere around 11/16. Sort of massaged the bar down there and tapped the dent out with a rubber hammer. So that's okay now. They go this way round, so that end goes on the head. This end goes against the block. The head's got a little conical recess in, and the perfect thing to go in there these days is an O-ring, which sits very well in there. And then at the other end, it has a spring and a little washer that sits against the casting there with another O-ring on it to seal it up. Again, the casting is slightly conical. So that's what I'm going to do now. It means sliding the cylinders off about, well, an inch or so just to get it all in. It's one of those jobs where you need about 7 pairs of hands. I'll try to keep the rudeness to a minimum. This nut under here is a right swine to get at. One can only use the open end of the spanner and getting a lot less of a sixth of a turn, having to turn the spanner around each time, so the jaw is angled differently. So effectively it's 12 movements, 1 rotation. Definitely a job for the apprentice. I think once the nut is run down a little further, one can get the ring on the end of it. Maybe it's easier. It's very easy to bash into these aluminium tubes as well, of course. We know they're easy to damage, so yet another place where sort of unintended damage can take place. The eagle-eyed amongst you will have noticed that I didn't get the washer or the O-ring in the end here. I gave up on it. It was actually too impossible to hold everything and do. There was another reason I gave up as well. Originally, these engines had an oil feed to the top. You can see here I've put grease nipples in. They're metric grease nipples, and I'm going to grease the valve gear for the sort of short time the engine is running in the foreseeable future. It originally had a big bolt-on gallery that went across. I've still got the gallery. It fed off of the rear oil gallery with a very metered supply, so just a little metered hole, and it fed the valve gear on each head. I think the feeding the valve gear oil in itself was very successful, and I've seen a lot less wear in the top end of this than I have on a sort of equivalent aeronca or Jap engine. But the idea was that the oil returned back into the crankcase via here. But in practice it didn't. It actually leaked terribly out of here, and they were known for leaking oil. And if you look closely at Mr. Harold Brooks' aircraft, the Hilson Praga he flew from England to South Africa in 1936, it's actually got an oil feed into the crankcase. So he was able to top the crankcase up on the long legs, because obviously the engine leaked quite a lot of oil. Llewellyn's engine, on the other hand, is a aeronca Jap. That managed the 10 hours from Tabora and all the way down to Abercorn and back when he turned back because of the low cloud, without any extra oil in the engine, just the normal amount without any extra oil feed whatsoever. Well, both sets of pushrod tubes are in place and the cylinders are tightened up. I just put the hub on, just slid it on with a key just to make sure it rotates nicely. So let's try that. Well, it's nice and smooth, and the breather is making the lovely sounds it should, as Arthur Ord Hume described, like an octogenarian with bad catarrh. So that seems to be working all right. The next jobs are assemble the rocking gear, which is all done, push rods and everything all ready to go back together. Put the inlet tubes on, put the magneto on, make some leads. We'll look at the carburettor. I don't think the carburettor should go on until it's on the test rig. It's too easy to damage it dangling down there on the stand. So I think we'll leave the carb off until it's actually bolted on the test rig. And we need to look at the slightly thorny issue of a propeller. Anyway, I'm going to keep going all week with putting it together, obviously filming as I go. I'll see you again next weekend. Thanks for watching.